A very warm welcome to all of our attendees out there. So this morning's Toolbox Talk, as we mentioned last week, is about scaffolding. And scaffolding, yes, we know it is a hazardous environment. It is dangerous to work on scaffolding, and that is purely because of the heights that we are working at. But we want to look at it from a different aspect. We want to look at the scaffolding itself. Many of us, or many safety officers that work on site, take working at heights very seriously, and that's because it's the second highest death rate occurring in South Africa. This is falls from a height. Now, it's not always on a construction site. A lot of the times it's at private homes where stringent safety controls are not being cared for. Yes, a lot of this is also happening on construction sites where a lot of safety is being put into place, and that is purely because of the training that isn't being done for some of the guys working on the scaffolding. Although they've got working at heights training, they might not know a little bit more about the actual scaffold itself. And that's why we're going to change our toolbox talk this morning. Although we're speaking about the environment of scaffolding, we are not really going to be speaking about working at heights as such. We realize that is a danger, and we will handle that on a separate Toolbox Talk topic, but here we want to discuss the scaffolding itself and why we need to ensure a safe scaffold for everyone. Now, we know it is dangerous. We don't even have to ask you that question. Do you think it's dangerous? We understand the dangers of working on a scaffold. Now, there are many, as we mentioned, one of them being working at heights. The other is if tools or equipment are laying around in the working platforms, in the landing platforms, or anywhere on the scaffold where somebody's going to walk or work on. And this can cause tripping, slipping hazards. You can also drop tools from a height. If you're working under a scaffold, you realize that is also dangerous, where you have the possibility of falling objects, falling tools, or other things coming at you from these different platforms that workers are working on. But now the scaffolding itself, staging as it's called on a lot of sites, is just a temporary structure used to support employees and materials. And this is to aid in construction, maintenance, or repairs, or whatever scope of work you're performing. And many of you that we've spoken to over the past few weeks have mentioned how often you're actually using scaffolding, to the point where some of you have even gone and purchased your own scaffolding, while many others cannot afford to spend that amount on scaffolding, and so you are still hiring or renting scaffolding. So we want to handle those two questions this morning. What are the dangers and what should I look out for if I am building the scaffold? So I've purchased the scaffold myself. I've gone through all the legal requirements of ensuring that I'm competent to own the scaffolding that I have. Or maybe the second question, somebody else built the scaffolding. So does that remove responsibility of safety away from me? Or what is my responsibility toward that scaffolding that I am working on, even though I am not responsible for building it? So let's look at both of these. Whether you built a scaffold or whether somebody else built a scaffold, what responsibility do you have toward the actual scaffolding? Aside from working on the scaffolding, ensuring that it is safe for me to work on or work around. So the first one is I'm building the scaffolding. So I've purchased the scaffolding. I've ensured that it's within my budget, and because I'm using it so much, it's so much easier for me to just erect the scaffolding for the site myself. First thing we're going to ask you is, what type of scaffolding are you actually using? Now, there's many different types of scaffolding, from quick stage to aluminium tower scaffolding. It really depends on the scaffolding that you are using. We remember that legislation that applies to all scaffolding is your SANS 10085 or your construction regulations if you are in the construction industry. If you're not on a construction site, just refer to SANS 10085, and this will give you the full health and safety standard, including a proper safe operating or safe working procedure for scaffolding, whether it's erecting that scaffolding, dismantling that scaffolding, or even the maintenance of that scaffolding. Another question we're going to ask you is, what are you going to use the scaffolding for? Now, a tower scaffold could be used to do small plumbing works. Perhaps if you are performing electrical works as well. You could move it in and around an environment, whether it's on caster wheels or on base jacks and needs to be moved around. This type of scaffold can be used then to access areas where you couldn't normally reach with a ladder. But perhaps you're using it for a different use. Perhaps you're using it to chase walls on the side of a building to install plumbing. Or perhaps you erected the scaffolding on the side of the building, maybe 10, 15 meters high, in order to put drop downs in, gutter drop downs, and all of these piping needs to be installed from a scaffold. Well, then you realize the different applications means that the scaffold needs to be erected in a different manner. See, a tower scaffold cannot be more than its smallest base size, times 4. However, when you take a look at the side of a building, you now need to have stays, you need to have tie-ins, you need to ensure that that scaffold is not just tied into the building, but it is safe and secure and structurally sound to handle not just the weight of the scaffold itself, but also the weight of the materials and persons that you are putting onto that scaffold. And then you have to think about the bracing. Is the scaffold going to move? Is it going to shift? All things that we need to consider when we are building our own scaffold. Then also the area where the scaffolding is going to be built. So the where is also very important. Oftentimes on the side of a building, we've got very good concrete ground, and that is because the building itself has to have a very strong foundation. And that means within a few meters in and around that building is also going to be a compacted, strong foundation. This doesn't mean, though, that we cannot go and do a site visit. Again, very, very important is doing a site visit for where that scaffolding is going to be erected, because the ground is going to make a very big impact on the stability of our actual scaffold. So caster wheels can only really be used when it's a level, flat piece of ground. Most often we are going to be looking for concrete and not really tiles, because tiles can be damaged, although it has been used on tiles before. But then you also want to ensure that the tiles are protected wherever you're putting the scaffolding on. And these can become expenses that we do not want to pay for when we might potentially damage the flooring or the tiles around the personal homes that we are working in because of the scaffold that we are erecting. If you are using base jacks or base plates, obviously you want to ensure that the ground underneath it is not soft, it's not going to give way, it's nicely compacted, it's strong, it's substantial, because really the base or the foundation of our scaffolding is going to determine the rest of the scaffold's integrity, or structural integrity, that is. So again, we need to know what type of scaffolding you're using, and then what are you going to be using it for will determine how you're going to build that scaffold, and where you build that scaffold will determine the dangers of the actual stability of the scaffold, and potentially within your risk assessment, the dangers of the environment that you're going to be working in as well. Again, if you need any information, either reach out to us or simply go and download, purchase a copy of the SANS 10085 legislation for scaffolding, and then also refer to scaffolding in your construction regulations as well. But with any scaffolding that you are going to be erecting, dismantling, or altering, especially because you are owning your own scaffolding, you need to have a proper scaffolding plan. Now, planning with scaffolding is essential. This is completely before we've even decided to stage our scaffolding anywhere. We need to have a correct plan. And again, we cannot remind you or obviously give you that importance of doing a site visit when working with scaffolding. And again, we're talking about you erecting your own scaffolding. So what is your scaffolding plan going to consist of? Well, once you've decided the type of scaffolding and what you're going to be using it for and where you're going to be putting it in, we need to ensure that the ground is inspected for the wear question. And this wear is going to obviously ensure that the scaffolding that we stage is going to be structurally sound for the tools, equipment, and persons that we are going to place onto that scaffold. Now, who should essentially be checking this? Well, competent persons. So the team that you may select is going to be a scaffolding supervisor. This is a person that also checks the ground and the surrounding. Then once the scaffolding is staged by 4 competent scaffolding erectors as a minimum, please remember your SANS code states that at least 4 scaffolding competent erectors are needed to build a scaffold. And that's your minimum requirement. You can have 20, you can have 50 people, but you cannot have less than 4 people erecting a scaffold. Then a separate person is a scaffolding inspector, not part of the 4 and not also a scaffolding supervisor. You want to have individual persons that roles or responsibilities in terms of the scaffolding are designated with legal documents, legal appointments, and they must be different people. So you cannot have a scaffolding supervisor or scaffolding inspector that is part of your erecting or dismantling team. This is obviously because that person can be biased. They were erecting the scaffold themselves or dismantling it themselves, and so they don't feel the need to really inspect it properly. So a separate scaffolding inspector must always be on hand to check that scaffolding. Now, the plan will take you from start, the type of scaffolding you're using, what you're using it for, where it's going to be inspected with all your ground inspections as well, and then the methodology of how you're going to go about setting up each of the stages. And each stage that you set up needs to be checked for not just structural integrity, but also for the bracing to ensure it's not going to twist or shift while the other scaffolding is being built, or once it's completely built, that it's not going to shift or fall or perhaps collapse, especially while people are working on it. Now, we've heard this before, it's happened before. We've seen scaffolding fall, we've seen it in pictures, perhaps in videos, and this is not always because somebody hasn't checked it, but because it wasn't checked for the correct things. So yes, from the outside, a scaffold might look right, but what are you actually looking for in terms of a scaffold when we talk about a working platform? This is where we are actually going to place people onto it in order to work. And here we've got the 2 different types of scaffolding. Obviously on the right hand side, you've got a normal tower scaffold that can be used for different works, especially for many of the plumbers and electrical guys out there. This is the ideal type of scaffolding for you. Is not very big tasks that you're going to perform on this, but you can get a lot of work done on these types of tower scaffolding. But for many of us with big construction works, we're going to be using the type of scaffold that you see on the left-hand side, where you're actually going to erect it on the side of a building. It's going to be tied into the building. We might even leave off the guard and the knee rail on the one side facing the building in order for us to perform our work so it doesn't create an obstruction. But when we design this type of scaffold, it's very, very important to ensure the structural integrity against the actual building. And this is what we call a tie-in. So we actually tie or bolt into the actual structure to ensure that our scaffold becomes as strong as the structure that we're actually working on. And this is because the scaffolding that we're building is obviously pretty high, it's quite wide, and we need to ensure that the people working on this are not going to fall out of the scaffold. So it must be a working platform that is completely protected on all sides, but at the same time it is tied into the building so that the scaffold does not fall away or move or shift from the actual structure. So a working platform must have some basic elements, and these basic elements are things like guardrails, which includes a knee rail. So you'll notice there on both of the scaffolding, you will see the working platform has a handrail, which is at the height of a hand, and then also a knee rail, which is at the height of a knee. Now, if you just follow your eyes a little bit down, you will see that it also includes toe boards. Now, toe boards are there to prevent tools and equipment from being kicked off a scaffolding, or perhaps equipment that we are placing on there. Sometimes even if we are stacking bricks or cement pockets on top of this working platform, these cannot be kicked or shifted off of the actual scaffold. Now, if you're stacking things such as bricks higher than 2 to 3 stacks on the actual scaffold, ensuring that it can actually carry that weight, the toe board will then need to be higher. Or you will then now need to start putting a catch net on to ensure that the height of the stack is not going to topple over and move past the toe board. So yes, there is a minimum requirement for the toe board, but we also need to identify what we are using the scaffolding for. This will determine if we need a higher toe board. So you can see that these questions that we ask before we even perform the task is vitally important for the construction of the scaffold. Now, if you don't own a scaffold, these are a lot of the questions that the person hiring the scaffold to you might ask. And if they're not asking it, they are going to build just a normal scaffold according to SANS, but all according to the minimum requirements. But if you do not identify the additional hazards that may be on that scaffold, then you as the person performing the work is going to be held responsible for those additional hazards. So please remember, communication and proper planning, whether you own your own scaffold or whether you're hiring a scaffold, is still important to ensure the safety of the works that is going to be performed. Now, a few other things that you must have on a scaffold, again, it's a minimum requirement, is safe access. And this is to get people on or off that scaffold in a safe manner. So you will notice that the working platform is a fully decked platform. There's no spaces for anybody to fall through. But oftentimes you are going to find a trapdoor, and the trapdoor leads to a ladder. Now the ladder or the access ladder must protrude at least 900 millimeters over the working platform. So 900 millimeters is generally where your hand or guardrail is going to be, depending on the type of scaffolding you use. And this is where the scaffolding ladder or access ladder is going to be placed. It will then go through the actual trapdoor down to a landing platform or perhaps another working platform, dependent on the type of scaffold you are using. Again, that trapdoor must be closed at all times while a person is working on the scaffold. So if you enter through or exit through that trapdoor, please ensure it is always kept closed. And the reason why it is kept closed is so that there is no hole in your scaffolding platform deck. So please ensure that these minimum requirements are there. We can talk about other things like ledges and connectors and standards, but really, if you own your own scaffold, you identify with these things. And if you don't, and you've worked on a scaffolding before, you can see the necessity of why all of these components are in place. Generally speaking, the inspection registers for scaffolding will also include these items. And so the person inspecting the scaffold will then be able to identify it. And that's why it's so important for this person to be competent in the erecting, dismantling, or replacement and changes of an actual scaffold. So when it comes to scaffolding safety, not just access is important, but safety should start right from the beginning, right from the planning stages. We want to ensure safe measures are always kept. So your scaffolding plan should also include another point, and this is the outline of how the scaffolding must be used. So this is a safe working or safe methodology of how the scaffolding should be used. You can ask yourself, is a harness going to be needed on the scaffold? Is a harness always needed on a scaffold? No, not always. But there are instances where scaffolding will need to have a person working at heights in an actual harness as well. Then what are the acceptable anchor points for either the person using a scaffold with a lifeline and a harness, or what are the correct anchor points to tie in to the building? These are additional items that must also be included in your scaffolding plan. Then during the use of the scaffold, there must be continuous inspections that have to take place. At a minimum, it needs to be done every 7 days, and at a minimum after inclement weather, which is rain, storms, lightning, high wind, or any water or flooding that happened in that area. So any inclement weather will require you to inspect that scaffold immediately after that has occurred, or every 7 days if there has been no inclement weather. Again, this is the minimum requirement. So perhaps you get to a site and the safety officer is requiring you to inspect your scaffold every day before use. Can they do that? Yes, it is acceptable to ask you to inspect your scaffold every single day before using it. Remember, we can always take the law and make it better, but we can never go above the law. So please, if you have any person telling you that you do not have to inspect a scaffolding every 7 days, you can do it every 2 weeks or every month, please do not listen to that. You cannot go above the law. You cannot make a new law for the scaffolding you use. But what you can do is take the minimum requirements and make it better. So you can check it every single day before you use it. Now, what are you looking for? If somebody else has built a scaffold, you want to ensure that it is safe to use. And this is where the green safety use tag must always be present. But please, if you see a green safety use tag, don't automatically feel that just because somebody else's responsibility was to build that scaffold, that you do not have a responsibility. You are not off the hook because you are putting your safety in the hands of those who have erected that scaffolding. So even though you are not planning the build or inspecting the ground or even managing the scaffold, you still need to check whether it is safe for you to use it. So when you see a green safety use tag, please take a look at the back of the tag as well. Has it been inspected within 7 days? If you remember that there was rain yesterday, have you checked whether the scaffold was inspected today? If not, please contact the scaffolding supervisor or inspector and ensure that they get it signed off for you as well. Remember, you are putting your life on that scaffold. So take note of a few things. Not just the safety use tag, but also the date and the type of scaffolding that is being used. Has it been signed off? What should a working platform consist of? As you've just taken a look in the picture, it must have hand and knee rails or a full guardrail. It must have a fully decked platform with toe boards. It must have safe access. It must be tied, braced, or supported in the correct manner to ensure stability. These are basic minimum requirements that you can look at. So if a scaffold has been inspected and you notice that the working platform does not include toe boards, well, perhaps you need to get somebody to come and ensure that that is done first before you climb onto that scaffold. Do you need to wear a harness on that specific type of scaffold? Your risk assessment will outline what is necessary. Where are you placing your tools? Are you required to have your tools on lanyards while working on the scaffold? Again, refer to the scaffolding plan where the risk assessment will outline the safe working procedure. Then very importantly, if you are not responsible for changing or altering a scaffold, please never move, adjust, alter, or change the scaffold in any way. This must be done by the competent scaffolding team and then signed off again. Even if something is removed or replaced, within a few seconds, the entire scaffold has to be re-inspected. And that is because you have altered the structural integrity of that scaffold. So please, whether you own your own scaffold, whether you are hiring scaffold, it is still your responsibility to ensure your safety and the safety of your employees working on that scaffold. So thank you very much.